There are nights when not even crickets dare to sing. The wind carries with it ancient secrets, scratching windows and causing goosebumps that don't just belong to the cold. A man walks through the red earth of an isolated reserve. His steps sink into mud and memories of fear. He carries the color of the wolf in his eyes, but his heart beats restlessly, demanding answers in the face of the inexplicable. Around him, darkness seems to whisper calls that he pretends not to hear. The past has not died, it just waits with clenched teeth. Growing up alone under the rigid shadows of tradition, his gaze always searched for signs. Crooked branches, missing sheep, footprints where there should be no footprints. His grandfather told stories at the foot of the campfire, warning about what crawls between worlds. At first, it was all just folklore, until the first transformation crept into the village. The cold blood that flowed into the forest did not belong to any common animal. Scattered organs and a hungry gaze shining among damp leaves. The adults retreated, murmuring prayers in forgotten tongues, while the children squinted hard, trying to scare away things they saw unintentionally. The right night came without warning. Something broke the silence and blew a feral breath on the back of his head, the border between wakefulness and delirium. With each step into the dark, the air seemed heavier, stickier, with that smell that mixes wet and decomposed flesh. Fear walks on four legs, but sometimes it wears the skin of people. He felt that he was watched, but there were no eyes, only the certainty that he was not alone. He was never, in fact. To carry a heritage of pain is to cross internal deserts where shadows grow and, from time to time, become flesh. Living near the Skinwalker's domains is getting used to unspoken codes. Don't whistle at night, don't pronounce real names, don't respond to the call of one's own name from the dark. The terror there does not scream, it just leans, brushing its shoulders and instilling doubts about its own sanity. How many times did he wake up wondering if the footprints in the backyard belonged to an outsider, or to an unconscious torn by bad dreams? The body can resist panic, but the mind learns to survive by sneaking between paranoia and resignation. The stories are never the same, but they all share the same dissonant song, noises that don't fit, voices that repeat memories they shouldn't know, animals standing still for too long, staring into the void. He came to understand that there are horrors as old as heaven, horrors that do not seek redemption, only companionship. In the solitude of his own thoughts, he recognized the root of the fear that paralyzes. It is not the unknown outside, but that animal and dark, caged under his own skin. At the end of that morning, when he returned muddy and dirty with strange blood, he noticed the frightened look of those who were waiting for him. They knew, no one comes back the same. The earth does not return intact those who look too deep. Into the abyss of secrets, only survivors remain, trying to learn to pick up the pieces of the mind buried by waking nightmares. There is the feeling that something now inhabits him, a remnant of ancestry, hungry for what is left of the human. It devours slowly, stealthily, like a wolf that does not let itself be seen but never ceases to sniff. Between man and monster, there is a line as thin as the distance between a bad dream and that which whispers its name in the deepest hour. Of the night, the wolf watches, man listens, and the silence there was never the same again. Winter in the Navajo region, on the border between Arizona and New Mexico, is an animal apart. It courts time with biting winds, tiring dry trees, and punishing the fragile frames of wooden houses. Those who are born here learn from an early age that silence is not empty. He carries memories, whispers promises, and carries on his back a collection of secrets never confessed. Martin Gray was one of those who tried to forget himself with long steps and restrained breathing, or at least that was what he repeated when he looked at his reflection in the windows of the old truck. Hailing from Albuquerque, Martin left behind a barren routine of unanswered phone calls, sleepless nights, and a succession of personal failures that tangled like weeds in his bedroom wall. He was 31 years old, shoulders already arched by the weight of expectations never fulfilled and the kind of opaque look that is acquired after many new beginnings and no real novelty. Torn between fear and hope, he left for Tuba City, in the heart of the Navajo land, seeking the calm of those who want to start over in a small town, among people who do not pronounce their name behind half-open doors. From a young age, Martin breathed insecurity. His father, Jack Gray, a retired police officer and man of few words, never allowed weakness. At home, the lessons came in the form of silence. Every gesture, a secret. Each look, a demand changes by strength and courage. His mother, Annabelle, tried to make up for it with affection, but Martin grew up like a desert, dry inside, always fearing that it would not be enough. The studies in Farmington did not bring the expected comfort. He felt out of place, unable to belong or fit in. Behind the appearance of a scented man pulsated the restlessness of those who had never learned to call any place home. Martin wanted only peace, a shelter where he could build anything resembling a normal life. I wanted to learn to sleep without fear, to silence memories of fights, professional failures, and that night terror of never really being seen, even though I was in front of everyone. He settled in a simple house at the end of a dusty road, leaning against the reddish rocks and facing a small pine grove that seemed to breathe with the night. The town of Tuba City offered few pleasures: an old convenience market, a church, forgotten by time, and bars where voices murmured like wind past dead leaves. In the early days, Martin noticed the discreet signs that something there didn't fit. It wasn't just the old aura of the place, or the old lords of the dirt streets, reluctant to give it a direct look. It was the dense atmosphere, an invisible pressure that settled in his bones, as if the earth itself asked for secrecy. The nights seemed longer in that remote house. There was always a noise, a brief scratch coming from the attic, a sound that, when investigated, never found an echo, as if escaping from his eyes. The paintings he brought from his old life, childhood photos and memories of simpler times, disappeared and reappeared in different places, even if he swore to have left them in a different room. The little twisted things began to pile up. The mud footprints in front of the back door when no one had passed by, the smell of raw meat that occasionally filled the air before dawn. The neighbor's dog, always agitated, stopped barking near Martin's window and instead stood motionless, staring at the shadows, his bristly fur, the beast-like posture waiting for the worst. Throughout the third week, an unusual cold took over the interior of the house. Despite the dry and icy climate of the desert, the air seemed to freeze in the rooms in the early mornings, smelling of wet earth and rusty iron. The clock, invariably, stopped at 3 in the morning, leaving the runner shrouded in a sinister gloom, as if time refused to continue in that place. It was at times like this that Martin felt the weight of loneliness the most. He forced himself to repeat phrases of encouragement, although he did not believe them. Images, dark stains on the wood, shapeless shapes reflected in the window, began to populate the mind, bringing that sense of presence that only those who have ever felt observed can truly describe. Conversations in the city have also changed. Some residents, such as old Samuel Yazzie, avoided passing in front of the woods at dusk. The bravest boys braved their courage to cross the train track after sunset, but they never did so without first scratching strange symbols on the earth. Whispers ran through the houses about what dwelt in the shadows, about yellow eyes that shone among the trees, and about an ancient creature clothed in human skin, but wild as night. Folklore bathed the foundations of these people, but to Martin, it all sounded like a wounded ego, a way of giving shape to the fear that grew invisible. Still, he woke up one night startled by something scratching outside, heavy steps that didn't match any known animal there. He saw, through the crack in the curtain, two shimmering orbs staring at his window. Eyes that didn't blink, that understood more than was comfortable. The discomfort spread. There was a rush to lock doors before night. He felt the pulse of old fear, a heritage that might never be possible to leave behind. Even without knowing it, Martin was no longer just an outsider. He was a piece dragged into the board, a man with a broken soul before the silent abyss of Navajo, where secrets have eyes, and the night brings with it something hungry and very old. The nights in Tuba City seemed to extend beyond the limits of any clock. Time there did not form hours, but lapses of restlessness, a succession of silences interrupted by sounds that did not match common landscapes. Martin realized early on that the walls of his new home held more than dust. There were whispers in cracks. The creaking of the boards took on its own meaning, as if recording the footsteps of someone who had never entered. One morning he woke up with his heart racing, taken by a sudden certainty that he was not alone. The sound seemed to rise slowly from the bowels of the house. A rough drag, then the brief cry of an injured animal suffocated by the wind. When Martin stood up, the light from the lamp flickered, creating shadows that danced on the walls. He noticed fresh mud footprints coming in from the hallway, marks he saw on the opposite side of the door, and ended before he reached the room. It couldn't be a mistake. It was as if someone or something had started to appear, and then given up, returning to the night. The tension grew even more in the following nights. Objects subtly changed places without any logic. The old picture frame, a gift from his mother when moving, mysteriously appeared lying on the bathroom window frame. An old coffee mug disappeared from the table and was found days later under the trapdoor of the attic, full of damp leaves and small light bones, positioned as if they were part of a bizarre ritual. Even the hanging photos looked crooked every morning, pointing slightly to the woods across the road. The feeling of being watched deepened. Martin, after hurrying through pale corridors, began to lock each door before going to sleep. And so from inside the room, he still heard distant moans going through the structure of the house, as if carrying coded messages. In the moments between sleep and wakefulness, she swore she heard her own name, whispered by a hoarse, scratchy voice close to her ear. This call was not a memory or nightmare, but something solid, capable of chilling the blood. In an attempt to seek support, Martin forced himself to go to the downtown market, a place with a strong smell of coffee and old wood, walls decorated with warning pamphlets and messages that had been posted for a long time. There he met Ruth Moses, a business owner and a woman who, with her face furrowed by time, seemed to keep in her eyes an unsettling wisdom. She poured him coffee and, between loose words, suggested that Martin avoid certain trails after dark. Residents, she said, are quick to distinguish the sounds of life from those who advertise bad company. Despite the warning, Ruth never spoke openly about anything. She answered specific questions with old stories, not always with a definite ending. When he asked about strange footprints, he heard from her only one, "Here the earth tells everything. That needs to be known. Listen more." Martin also crossed paths with John Begay, a man in work boots, always rubbing his hands as if trying to clean up mud that never came out. He said, between muffled laughter and furtive glances, that the old men said there were things in that forest that prefer solitude. "Sometimes the forest looks back at you," he commented, without laughing completely. When Martin asked if he knew stories about different animals or creatures, John avoided answering, fixing his gaze on the twisted branches visible through the window. Martin left with the strange feeling that everyone already knew something not shared with outsiders. The discomfort took on physical proportions. Her stomach twisted whenever she passed through the attic hallway. Her skin tingled when she walked around the back of the house. He didn't know if the fear was internal, forged by broken memories, and the feeling of failure, or if it was something external coming from there, from the land itself. One night on the edge of the woods, he heard what sounded like the howl of a wolf, although locals assured that wolves had been extinct in the region for generations. The sound of that lament was different, heavy, as if it mixed the lament of a wounded man and the ancient call of forgotten animals. On another occasion, after a sudden storm, he found strange symbols scratching the damp earth by the fence, circular shapes, crossed lines, and signs that looked ancient. He photographed, but by the next morning, the marks had disappeared under freshly fallen leaves, as if they had never existed. The neighbor's dog, which usually stayed close to the house, disappeared for 3 days, returning thin, staggering, and with a transformed look, wilder, less domestic. Trying to find explanations, Martin began to visit the community library, more often, where he met Sarah Williams, a librarian with a delicate voice, attentive eyes, and too discreet a manner for such a small town. When I asked him about the local stories, she smiled toothlessly, lowered her head, and handed him an old, untitled book. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages. "You've felt those eyes on you, haven't you?" he said, his voice barely audible. Martin nodded, but Sarah quickly changed the subject, suggesting that she come help organize old books someday, as if that brief exchange had gone too far. With each meeting, Martin returned to greater isolation between evasive answers and looks that owed more to fear than sympathy. He collected disconnected phrases, fragmented legends, and signs that fed paranoia. I wrote everything down, tried to make sense, but the more I immersed myself in this search, the less the world seemed to make sense. It was as if that land had its rules, so many and so old that they tried to push it out all the time. Still, between the freezing dawns and the memories of almost unbearable loneliness, Martin kept trying to figure out what kind of secrets slept under the weight of that silence. Every noise, every object out of place, every whisper heard before waking up made up an opera of discomfort that only seemed to herald the beginning of something much bigger and much more dangerous. Martin's routine had become a cycle of obsessive observation and sleepless nights. Discomfort was now a constant companion, but also a stimulus. The stronger the fear, the greater became the desire to know what was really hidden in the shadows of the woods and between the walls of his house. The tracks, though scattered, were beginning to line up in an unsettling pattern. During an overcast morning, as he tried to ignore the strange marks that streaked the earth again after each night, Martin noticed a loose board on the attic floor. He spent hours gathering the courage to explore it, tormented by the memories of the nocturnal sounds coming right from there. Armed only with a flashlight and his breath suppressed, he made room among the old boxes, smelling the smell of rotting wood and old dust. Behind a crate, he found a wrought iron box, black, heavy and cold even in daylight. The lock no longer held anything. It hung on its side, broken for a long time. Inside, piles of yellowed letters, photographs from past centuries, local newspapers, small stone figures with animalistic features and rustic drawings, with long eyes and pupils cut by a horizontal line. Among the letters, many signed by familiar names in the region. One of them, written by someone named Eleanor B. Gay, dated 1926, reported in detail stormy nights, people taken by strange behaviors, and above all, unexplained disappearances on farms near the forest. "When voices come from the woods, no one should answer," read one of the excerpts. "Evil has the steps of a wolf, but it wears the face of ours." The photos showed families lined up in front of Martin's house, the building identical to the present. In one, children held branches of rue, while behind them, among the dark trees, there were bright spots that looked like eyes peeking in the dim light. One of the newspapers mentioned the outbreak of violence in the 1950s, when accusations of witchcraft and savage rituals spread terror through Navajo villages. The Gray family name came up amid the turmoil, tied to accounts from residents who swore they had heard plaintive creatures during the night. But the most disturbing thing was in the drawing of a figure, half man, half beast, hairy skin, bright eyes, and hands elongated like claws. On the footers, instructions in Navajo scrawled as warnings. As he leafed through it, he felt the air getting colder. A strong impact sounded on the wall, echoing through the attic ceiling. Flashlight lights flickered, and a strong smell of burning flesh suddenly rose. The fear was paralyzing, but the momentum of discovery kept Martin there. One of the documents, a nearly undone birth certificate, had the name of Martin's own grandfather, Jack Gray, next to a date similar to that of a disappearance narrated in the letters. Martin's father, after that date, had moved to Albuquerque, breaking all ties with the place. He suddenly saw his own face reflected in an old painting, the same line in his eyes, his grandfather's crooked smile. The bond was undeniable, and, in a way, all signs pointed to a family cycle that was never really broken. The discomfort soon turns to terror the next night. As he stared at the letters scattered on his bed, he noticed that the charcoal lines he had scratched to protect the entrance had already been scratched, and symbols similar to those found on the box appeared scrawled on the window frame. Ichu. Air in the house became heavy, almost unbearable to breathe. Then came the whisper, no longer like an echo, but an intelligible voice, deep and slipped, calling him by name. He looked out of the window and saw, among the shadows of the woods, a figure that did not belong to everyday life. The being walked, upright, his densely hairy skin emerging. The dawn came heavy, thick, almost solid, as if the air was compressing around the house and Martin, suppressing every shred of security he had experienced since his arrival. The feeling of being surrounded by something invisible became unbearable. It was no longer the cold, nor the insistent sounds coming from the attic or the elongated shadows in the corners of the rooms. Now, a dense presence lurked in every empty space of the house, every silence of the night. In the first few minutes after lying down, Martin felt the bed shake under his body. At first, he attributed it to accumulated nervousness, rationalizing events that had already surpassed any logic, but soon realized that the movement followed a pattern, a slow beat, almost like a heart beating under the floorboards. He jumped to his feet, the icy sweat running down his forehead. He went down the stairs in thick socks, holding a flashlight, and the lights faltered, sometimes illuminating, sometimes swallowed by total pitch. In the kitchen, he heard a crack, then a creak. Standing in the dark, he smelled the acrid smell of wet skins and fresh blood. As he turned slowly, he caught his reflection on the glass of the window. Behind him, a hairy figure with yellow eyes. Fear prevented him from screaming. He turned quickly, and nothing was there but the biting silence. On the bathroom mirror, the dirty handprints appeared each morning, different in size and disposition. Martin would put it out with soap and water, but the next day they would come back as a continual reminder that he was not alone. One day, time seemed to be distorted. He didn't remember sleeping, but he woke up on the couch with his sweater dirty, hands smelling of weeds, dry leaves scattered on the living room floor, and dirt under his fingernails. He tried to reconstruct what he had done, but memories came in confused flashes. The sight of the woods at night, a figure crouching by the gate, the feeling of following someone or being followed, all interspersed with sounds of hoarse laughter and whispered promises. In Navajo, visits by local residents have abruptly ceased. The rare walks to Ruth Moses' grocery store became mere automatisms, almost a ritual to ensure that she still stepped on real soil. Ruth avoided Martin's eyes, delivering provisions in dense silence, and John Begay, once a talker, turned his face away whenever they crossed paths on the dirt street. Martin felt not only fear growing within him, but a strange animal pulse, a restlessness close to anger and hunger. When he finally mustered up the courage to search the attic again, he found the old stone figures lined up around his mattress, forming a jagged circle. In the center of the circle, there was a tuft of dark hair mixed with fragments of human nails. As he touched the figures, he heard dull buzzing, something muffled like screams coming from another plane, a cold that burned inside. One evening, the whole house seemed to shrink. The walls creaked as if the structure was breathing. Martin tried to get out, but the door seemed too heavy, and when he finally opened it, the wood was already too close, branches almost brushing. The frame. The trees squeezed around the house as if growing in accelerated time. The sky had become a thin band, the sun prevented from penetrating the environment. It was like living in a box, sealed by fear itself, nature taking over the space and pushing Martin into the heart of that dark secret. Night fell again, and Martin was awakened by sounds coming from outside, crawling footsteps, distorted voices, wails that sounded human but never quite. Seized by a mixture of horror and doubt, he approached the window to face or accept whatever it was. He saw in the midst of the fog a sudden movement. The Skinwalker. The creature emerged from the trees as a living shadow. It had shapes that evoked both human and animal, wolf eyes, sawed-off teeth, skin that changed texture as the light faltered. The gaze met Martin's, and he felt a painful twinge in his mind, as if tearing his memories and rummaging through them. The screams he had heard in the attic were now inside his head, repeating forgotten phrases from his childhood, voices from the family, fragments of the past interspersed with the sounds of breaking bones and distant howls. He tried to move away from the glass, but he realized that he did not fully control his own limbs. His feet stuck to the floor, his hands reached out automatically to the symbols on the walls, drawing again the patterns inherited from old newspapers, and drawings left by ancestors. Apparently, the entity not only manipulated his perception, but suggested intentions and movements to him. Memories of his grandfather that had been repressed had returned like a whirlwind, flashes of conversations, never understood, advice to avoid the night, words spoken in voices different from those of his grandfather. The feeling of being at the center of a cursed inheritance was now as physical as the pain in the bones and the fear throbbing in the back of the eyes. In the following hours, Martin no longer distinguished dream from reality. On the walls, images and symbols moved in front of him, taking shape and then dissipating, while whispers affirmed in Navajo and English that he was part of it, that the call had never ended, only waited. He heard the voice of his father, his mother, his own child, all mixed with the lament of the Skinwalker, who seemed closer and closer, confusing his identity, undermining his certainties. At the end of the night, kneeling on the ground covered with dirt and leaves, he realized he was no longer sure who he was, nor could he escape the dark cycle that seemed to engulf all generations of his family. The presence was real, oppressive, the house itself and the forest condoning, so that he would never be freed. The threat was no longer just a possibility. It was imminent, material, and impossible to ignore. And Martin found himself, for the first time, truly at the mercy of the supernatural. Martin woke up to the sun, only creeping in through the cracks in the window. The chaotic memory of the night before was stuck in his mind like fragments of an impossible nightmare to sweep. He felt his body aching, arms heavy, small purplish spots rising up his wrists, as if he had fought a physical struggle with his own walls. His brain throbbed with echoes of unknown voices and childhood images that would now seem less like memories and more warnings he had never been able to decipher. For a moment she felt like remaining motionless, becoming part of the floor and forgetting that she existed. But the urgency of survival spoke louder. A terrible calm hung over the house, a silence of suspended time. He could no longer specify where the outside world ended and where the domination of the entity began. In each corner he noticed objects moved, symbols redefined during his apparent torpor. The stone figures returned close to the door. The mirrors were opaque, unable to reflect any human image. Outside, the woods seemed to be waiting, motionless branches, leaves frozen by an invisible presence. Martin remembered looking at his own shadow in the morning and feeling that there was something wrong with it, as if it had too many limbs or something animal that didn't belong to him. In her eyes, there was still that feeling of stickiness, as if the darkness of the previous night had impregnated her mind, unable to be washed by the little sun. The steps taken by the house were calculated, insecure. With each noise his body trembled, the memory of the yellow eyes never leaving him. Still, she gathered enough courage to return to the attic before the light faded. Perhaps in the light of day he would be able to regain some control over the destiny of his own soul. He climbed slowly, feeling the planks groaning under the weight, but not in a natural way. There was a kind of rhythm, as if the house was breathing. When he opened the iron box again, he looked for answers in the drawings and scribbles, deciphering words that until then seemed only noise. Between phrases of dread and records of ancestral fear, he found a notebook of his grandfather's, with pages marked by scares and doubts similar to his own. The text pointed to a protection ritual done in a hurry on one of the last nights lived. There and mentioned that the creature fed not only on fear, but on guilt. There are things in us that we have never confessed. The Skinwalker sniffs out weaknesses and drinks them like blood, Martin read, feeling every word pierce his chest. It was at that moment that the voices returned, no longer as mere echoes, but as clear commands. "Confess," they demanded in Navajo, and then in a familiar whisper. Glimpses of childhood blew through his mind with the force of storms. His father's face, his mother's ever-rigid expression, the buried secret of the night he witnessed something strange in the woods behind the house many years ago. A shadow, creeping in, animal eyes sprouting in the darkness, the command never to speak or think of what he saw. He remembered feeling an inexpressible shame, guilt for not warning anyone, fear of being accused of inventing, fear of being different. That had grown inside like a root. As he descended, the symbols on the walls seemed to spin, opening and closing, painted eyes, watching every bit of his hesitation. The air became thick. It hurt to enter the lungs. Martin tried to move forward to cross the door, but it was like pushing against an invisible wall. The entity would not let him go easily. At that moment, the furniture began to vibrate. The structure of the entire house shook, the glass vibrating as if it wanted to shatter. Lights flickered, and all the rooms suddenly seemed to be in different places, shuffled together like an inverted maze. The physical and psychological worlds are confused. The nightmare reached its peak without announcement, with dawn about to break, and Martin being torn from his torpor by a bang that seemed to tear not only the planks of the house, but his own chest. The entire body covered by an icy electricity, Martin immediately realized the entity no longer hid its intention. The air in the room had become almost solid, bristling the skin, as dense and metallic as blood exposed to the cold wind. Each window pulsed, the shadows stretching across the walls and curling around him like living tongues of darkness. From the attic door, the insistent creaking began. Behind him, strands of black mist descended towards the stairs. The woods, outside, perhaps already inside the house, seemed to whisper in their own language, voices from other eras, dead and forgotten, all converging on that night when everything would be decided. The Skinwalker manifested himself in the room as a silhouette, first indistinct, then progressively sharper and more bestial, crouching body, long limbs, pointed ears, fur bristling in rags, anthropomorphic face deformed at the whim of hatred. The eyes, yellow blades casting light and helplessness. Martin felt every part of his body falter, and for a moment he believed that everything would fall apart, that there, at last, he would lose not only his life, but his identity. But the voices of the family mingled with the Skinwalker's high-pitched howl, bits of himself and others, voices superimposed, flee, fight, confess, accept. They repeated in circles until Martin almost went mad. The Skinwalker advanced, a monstrosity of living mythology, and from every wall and piece of furniture, familiar images were released. The grandfather, who had never dared to face him. The mother, cornered in the kitchen of childhood. His own inner child, smeared with guilt, watching through the glass in silence. The creature seemed to grow, feeding on the past, becoming almost an extension of the house and the soil. It was the rotten legacy that had always haunted the Greys, now reopened before him. Martins felt the strength slipping from his legs, but he remembered the words in his grandfather's notebook. He needed to resist by confession, by accepting his own pain. The Skinwalker rushed forward, his eyes piercing every weakness, and Martin fell to his knees, unable to breathe. The world turned. Whispered voices turned to screams, cries of pain, unfulfilled promises, secrets blown away generations ago. He realized that he could not win by force. The only way out was to break the cycle. Either he faced head-on what had always fled, or he would have the same end as so many others. The crucial choice lay ahead. Try to banish the creature by force, in a physical confrontation that would end in destruction, or accept yourself as part of the cycle, using courage to expose everything you repudiated about yourself. The Skinwalker stopped, eyes fixed on Martin's, waiting. In that second of suspension, Martin felt his legs move to the circle of stones and symbols in the center of the room. He swallowed his fear, looked at the creature with a mixture of pity and repulsion, and with a broken voice began to speak. He let the words flow, confessing to the void and to the Skinwalker all the little guilt and shame he had carried during his life, the secret of childhood that he never told, the silent judgments about his parents, the fear of not belonging, the thirst for escape, the fragmented desire to be someone else. The more he spoke, the more the creature's claws seemed to retract, his figure losing shape. Images of the past surfaced, and Martin, guided by horror and unexpected tenderness, asked for forgiveness from everyone he once left behind, including the monstrous shadow before him. In tears he admitted, "I see you, and you are my fear, my mistake, my inheritance, and perhaps my redemption." It was then that the Skinwalker, now oscillating between human and beastly form, fell to his knees before him. The cycle was exposed. They were both victims of ancient stories, flesh of flesh, inherited pain, incapable of being washed away without truth. An unseen force pushed the shadows away from the walls, the house shaking as if exhaling a deep sigh. The woods outside retreated. The cold has lost part of its edge. Finally the creature spoke, not in howl, but in human, guttural, frail words. "Now you know. Now you can choose." Martin understood that their shared truth was the last link. In the cycle, he had the chance to leave carrying that shadow forever, or leave it behind, while the wood and the house resealed the pact. He took a deep breath, stood up, touched the already exhausted beast, and, in a silent rite, drew the ancient symbol of protection on his own chest, his fingers trembling between relief and mourning. He turned his back on the creature, feeling. It crumbled in dust and faint light, and opened the door. The emotional impact burned on every nerve. There was an open wound, but also a new freedom. As he crossed the threshold, Martin's eyes were clouded with tears, shivering from the cold, but above all, from what he had ceased to be. He was another, lighter, aware that his past would never be forgotten, but now he was finally part of who he was. Behind him, the house stood motionless, Silent, shadow and flesh now separated, the forest waited with no promises of peace, but with the certainty that the truth said, even if late, appeases the old beasts and grants man the chance to continue. The morning that elapsed after the night of the confrontation looked like a new fabric, still rough and full of loose threads. But there was a luminosity there that had never penetrated that house before. Martin stood on the threshold for endless minutes, feeling the cold air needle under his skin, trying to distinguish if the silence was calm or just the harbinger of another storm. The woods, now far away, stood motionless, its black branches silhouetted against the grey sky. He took a deep breath, letting the smell of wet earth and damp wood fill his chest, and felt that something, in fact, had changed. On the outside, the house was the same. The windows still bore the marks of the nights of terror, the paint peeling, the steps creaking underfoot. Inside, Martin walked between familiar rooms, but nothing was quite as before. It was as if time had bent some old sheet, hiding old stains and exposing new ones. The stone figures lay huddled on the table, pale in the cloudy sun. The circle of symbols on the floor was blurred, as if everything had slowly dissolved during the night. Even so, there was a discreet relief in the air. The cold, merciless the day before, now allowed a gentle warmth, creating small pockets of comfort where fear had once reigned. In the bathroom, Martin noticed his reflection in the mirror for the first time in weeks. His eyes were deeper. Yes, his beard was scruffy, but there was a trace of peace and something ancestral there, almost a glow. He now had a barely visible scar just below his collarbone, marked by the symbol of protection drawn during the confrontation. That mark would be his memory, a pact sealed between man and legend, flesh and memory. He realized that, although free from the immediate yoke of the creature that haunted him, he could never erase that experience. He felt part of that soil, of the stories of the greys and the fears sown to the earth. The cycle had been broken, at least there for him, but not eliminated. When he went out into the backyard, still damp, he saw that the neighbors kept a respectful distance, quick glances, as if they knew that something fundamental had changed. Ruth Moses, distinctly more at ease, left a packet of homemade loaves at the gate, and John Begay's dog spun around the grounds, howling softly but without the suppressed panic of before. The residents themselves seemed to feel that remnant of tranquility on their skin, walking less tensely, opening windows, crossing their eyes without the urgency to flee from their own shadows. Even so, Martin noticed that something in the room remained out of place. In the forest, a bird with black feathers watched motionless, yellow eyes against the sky. Small animal bones, once scattered and scattered as signs of aggression, were now stacked in a circle at the foot of a tree. It was as if the forest was also trying to digest what had happened, to reorganize its own pacts. All the documents and letters discovered in the attic were carefully arranged by Martin in a box, which he buried next to the fence, marking the place with one of the stone figures. It was his way of thanking and, at the same time, sealing the past so as not to be harassed by it anymore. In the evening, he mustered up the courage and wrote a letter in his own hand, explaining, or trying to explain, what he had faced, his mistakes, his fears, and the wonder of knowing that he was part of something greater than any rational explanation could name. He kept it with the things he thought were important, almost like a reliquary for times to come. For some time, Martin experienced an almost unprecedented calm. He went back to work at the market, talking to the residents, rebuilding his routine. Contact with people was cautious, but less tense. Winter was still raging in the region, but within the walls of the house and the village, a silent hope took shape. Perhaps, after all, some form of peace was possible. However, even in tranquility, signs emerged that certain mysteries never really rest. On a Sunday morning, while walking through the woods, the same woods that had once been forbidden to him, Martin found fresh marks on the frozen ground. Small, footprints that were not wolf nor dog nor human, but hybrids, as if an animal undecided between two worlds had played there. The cold of the wind became a whisper, bringing back indistinct words, reminding him that the forest always watches who passes by. The next night, the house creaked louder than usual again, and a strange reflection danced in the kitchen mirror. Martin turned quickly, heart racing in a mixture of nostalgia and fear. For a moment, he thought he saw the outline of a shadow with pointed ears receding into the hallway. He approached, but there was nothing, except a primordial smell, the memory of the howl, and something subtly different in his own breathing. For a fraction of a second, he felt his own senses sharpened, almost able to distinguish the slightest movements in the darkness. Martin realized then that the pact made with the Skinwalker, as intimate and true as it was, had not fully appeased the land or the legacy that this place held. It was as if the mystery had changed cycle, looking for other ways to manifest itself. Deep down, he knew that abandoning Navajo or his home would not prevent the enigma from perpetuating itself. Perhaps he would be a part of them forever. And as winter began to give way to the promise of spring, Martin continued to live between two worlds, attentive to noises that no one else seemed to hear, keeping silences that only he understood. He knew, finally, that certain stories don't end. They just learn new ways to wait for the next traveler willing to listen, or for the next soul open enough to see wolf's eyes, a man's soul, in the darkened mirror of the night. If you enjoyed this mystery and want to dive even deeper into supernatural legends, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell so you don't miss any news, and come be part of this community of explorers of the unknown. Here you will always find chilling stories, debates, and a lot of exchange of ideas. So don't be left out. Let's unravel the next secret together. Sign up now and come with us.